Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331, Chapter 4. They followed the A9 south, walking through the night and into the next morning. Hermione hardly noticed the physical strain of it. As a wartime courier, she'd experienced the full spectrum of bodily pain. Blistered toes, chafed heels, chapped lips, and sunburnt skin. The emotional strain was likewise familiar. Most of Hermione's missions were undertaken alone. She ferried messages across the aisles and had no home base. No bed safe for what she could borrow or bastardize from her surroundings. She ate meals cold or smoked over a campfire and slept without shelter beneath the sky. Draco, on the other hand, looked uncomfortable, misplaced among Scotland's hills and heaths. He had developed a limp, which worsened as they walked. On their rare water breaks, his hands would shake from exhaustion. Water dripped from the corner of his mouth as he drank from their shared canteen, and he nearly dropped the tin of beans when she passed it over. But he pressed on, only stopping after the full 18 hours had elapsed, timed precisely by his wristwatch. They made camp off the road in the wilds of Cairngorms National Park. Afternoon light filtered through the thinning canopy, and Draco dropped her pack at the foot of a large tree. A dip in its roots created a crescent big enough to curl into. It might have been a comfortable place to stop, but it was far from secure. "We should keep looking," Hermione suggested, glancing back over her shoulder. She'd been checking behind them all morning, unable to shake the feeling of being followed. And even though she'd yet to see anything, her paranoia hadn't abated. If anything, it was growing worse. Draco didn't share her concern. "We stop here," he said, eyelids drooping. His words ran together as he spoke. "We'll take in shifts, 3 and 3. You first." If he were more alert, if Hermione thought he had enough energy to cast even a simple hex, she would have suppressed her laughter. "There's no way you're going to stay up for 3 hours." She wouldn't either, honestly, but then she didn't need to. Hermione only needed to stay awake longer than Draco did. Long enough to steal back her bag, her wand, her sealskin, and apparate away from him. "Fair point. Come here." He held an arm out to her. She glared. "I'm not sleeping with you." "Don't flatter yourself," he said with a scowl. "Don't bother thinking of escape." "I wasn't." "For a spy, you're a shite liar." He tossed the drawstring pack over. "Here, try it." She narrowed her eyes, ready for the trap. He just waited, gaze steady, patient for the proof of her nerve. Hermione set her chin and pulled the bag apart. She reached inside and found nothing, stomach dropping as her fingertips brushed the pack's empty bottom. She looked back up at him, eyes wide. "You lied to me," she said, dread curling in her stomach. Her livelihood, her identity, and her only source of power in this world. Gone. She should have known not to trust him. Should have fought harder to escape. He'd pricked the back of her eyes. You said you brought it. My seal, my cloak, my wand." "All there," Draco assured. "It's Huntfast. Only I can access the pack. Leave me or kill me, and you'll never see your wand or that ratty cloak again." Hermione paled and tossed her back over to him, careless and angry. That must have been the spell she hadn't recognized. "You're an asshole." The tug of a grin. "And you're arrogant. You're not the only clever person on the planet, you know. Not the only one with foresight." He set the pack beside him and reached out for her again. She didn't move. "You're right," he said. "There's no way I'll stay awake for another 3 hours to keep watch. Since I've now removed your incentive to run or maim me, we might as well both get 6 hours. Don't act like you don't need it." She did need it. Dearly. Nevertheless, she crossed her arms. "Stubborn witch," he muttered. "I'm not going to touch you if that's what you're worried about." It was, partially. Hermione was still adjusting to this new version of the boy she'd known. The cruel streak, the bitter humor, the cold practicality that seemed to override his long-lived prejudice. Worst of all, however, was the unpredictability. Draco said he wouldn't touch her, but would that promise hold when they were huddled together? She hadn't been intimate with anyone in over a year. Too much time traveling meant precious little to spend in bed with a lover. The idea of being with him sent her stomach plummeting. Even if he felt the same way, disgust was a feeble safeguard easily overcome by a need as primitive as sex. Even if he didn't touch her, there was another way he could hurt her. He could leave her. As her captor, Draco had all the power. At any point, he could rethink a situation, decide she wasn't worth the effort, apparate them to the Isle of Man, and endure his punishment. Or he could run away entirely, find his parents and a way out of the country, leaving her alone in the woods. Wandless, skinless, with no food and limited resources, in a rapidly chilling September. She might survive it, but if the Death Eaters were already on their trail, it was unlikely. She needed to rebalance the dynamic, give him a reason to stay with her, or, minimally, a reason to regret leaving. "I need a collateral," she said. "Collateral?" he repeated, voice flat. "Your wand?" "No." "Your shoes?" He scoffed. "Your ring?" His eyes widened in surprise, and he looked down at his hand, as if he'd forgotten the presence of the Malfoy signet on the fourth finger of his right hand. His gaze was blank, carefully so. After a moment of consideration, he twisted it off his finger and tossed it to her. "Don't know why you think that matters to me," he said, attempting disinterest. But his eyes betrayed him. His expression hardened as she slid the ring over her knuckle of her middle finger. She wondered if he'd ever gone without it before. She felt naked without whatever protection the ring and his ancestry provided. The band tightened against her skin, an unfamiliar and uncomfortable weight. "Satisfied?" The question was clipped. "No." But she got to her knees and moved towards him anyways. Draco tugged himself into the crescent of tree roots and looked up at her expectantly. Trying not to think about it, Hermione settled herself in front of him, leaving a good 3 inches between his front and her rear. He draped an arm across her torso and wrapped the straps of their supply bags around his wrist a few times. She shifted her hips, making sure he wouldn't accidentally brush the knife that was still tucked into her waistband. Draco pillowed his head with his arm and spoke low. "I'm a light sleeper. Try anything, and you'll regret it." "Likewise," she said with more venom than she could follow up on. He breathed a laugh. "My watch is set for 6 hours. See you then." She bit her tongue against the instinct to wish him a good night in return. After a brief breakfast, or supper more accurately, of cold sausage and stale bread, they were on their feet again, continuing south along the A9. A few hours into their second 18-hour leg, it started to rain. The precipitation alternated between a drizzle and a downpour. At first, Hermione tried to make the best of it. She opened her mouth to the sky for a drink, refilled their canteens, and removed her hair from its top knot. She worked her fingers through the stretched curls, massaging her scalp and wishing she'd thought to pack shampoo. As the temperature dropped with the sun, the rain's novelty wore thin. Her shoes and socks were soaked, squelching with each step, and though she wore her mac, she had tucked her wet hair beneath her hood. Cold streaks had soaked into her shoulders and down the back of her jumper, giving her a chill. Draco looked equally miserable. His platinum hair lay plastered to his forehead, dripping water into his eyes, and his limbs had grown worse. Hermione could only guess at its source. Ill-fitting shoes, an old injury. Either way, they were doing more harm than good walking in this weather. She caught up to him with a few quick steps. "We need to stop." Draco didn't even look at her. "No." "At least to dry off and cast an impervious." "No." "Malfoy." "We keep going," he said. Hermione stopped. "Why?" He didn't bother with a reply, just kept his steady pace, dragonhide boots repelling the water far more effectively than her old trainers, seemingly ambivalent towards her presence or absence. Hermione debated sticking her heels into the proverbial, or in this case, literal mud. He was being unreasonable, and she had no idea why. Any rational magic user would have paused ages ago, taken care of the problem with a couple of quick second-year spells, and traveled the rest of the way in relative comfort. Draco clearly was not rational, and he wouldn't tell her why. Hermione resented him well into the morning. When they were just north of Perth, the rain dried up, leaving overcast skies and variable wind. They crossed a sodden field recently shorn of its wheat harvest, and Draco kicked open a door to a disused shed. It smelled like mouse droppings and old oil, but at least it was dry. They moved without speaking, exhausted and instinctively aligned on what it would take to not be. Draco blocked the door with an old tool chest while Hermione spread a few hole-ridden tubs along the concrete floor. She stripped off her mac, shoes and socks, hanging them to dry across the tines of a rusty pitchfork. She longed to remove her denims. They were soaked to her knees, and the fabric, though softened by time and use, had started to stiffen. For a moment, Draco looked like he was debating the same dilemma. Ultimately, he decided against it, so Hermione followed suit. Draco laid down first, and though Hermione's body shivered uncontrollably, she nevertheless set herself 3 inches away from him. Draco draped his hand over her ribcage and with a squeeze pulled her close. Panic spiked through her as their bodies met, separated by clothing that suddenly felt far too thin. "No!" Hermione said urgently, pushing away from him, thinking of the knife at her hip. "No, I don't want—" "Oh, shut it," he mumbled. "You're cold, I'm cold. We'll be warmer together." Within minutes his breathing evened, deepened. He'd fallen asleep. The adrenaline was slow to fade from his system, but she did her best to match the cadence of his breath. Eventually she stopped shivering and fell asleep. Hermione pulled the hood of her coat tight. Wind had followed yesterday's rain. They'd been fighting the gusts all the way to Edinburgh and making poor time. It didn't help that they had both slept through Draco's watch alarm. They had intended to wake around 7:30 in the evening, just as they had all the nights before. Instead, they'd slept until midnight, cut embarrassingly close together, warm, dry, in what passed for comfortable on the floor of an old stinking bed. The extra rest had done little to improve Draco's already crotchety mood. He set a grueling pace, and Hermione knew better than to complain. His eyes contained a threat of thunderclouds ready to unleash their fury at a moment's notice. Instead, she kept quiet and close, handed him food and water when requested, played lookout when he tended to his necessities. Near noon, she spotted Edinburgh from across the Firth or Forth. Her eyes flicked to Draco. George Weasley and Lee Jordan manned an order safe house in New Haven. They'd been inspecting her yesterday. By now, they must have figured that something had happened. Maybe even mobilized a response. If she could convince Draco to go into the city, to steal food perhaps, or scrounge other supplies, she might be able to trigger one of the order's many lookout posts. She wouldn't even have to go into New Haven itself, just close enough so that one of them spotted her. She knew their routes and the general timing of their rounds. It could work. She cleared her throat as they neared the end of the Forth Road bridge. "We should go into the city." "No." An unsurprising answer. She continued to push. "We're low in supplies." "We have enough." "For a day or two, we'll need more." "We'll resupply somewhere else," he said. "No, we won't." He stopped to glare at her. "Edinburgh is the last large city we'll see until Liverpool," she continued. "We're going to be walking through the wilds and we need to resupply. It's easier to nick things from a big city. Break in while the muggles are at work, raid their cabinets and keep moving. Keep anonymous, we risk exposure in the smaller towns. And seeing as you refuse to do magic," he practically hissed at the reminder, "is this kind of nagging your bonehead friends had to endure?" "No," she shot back. "They listen to me when I have a good idea." The barb landed. Draco scowled, and they continued in sullen silence until the first eastward turn-off from the A9. "Fine," he growled. Hermione's heart leapt, but her joy was short-lived. "We'll case Queensferry, but we need to make it quick. My people will have realized that something went wrong. They'll be looking for me, and it'll better be for all parties if they don't find me." Hermione had been about to argue when a golden rocket of light shot past them. They exchanged a single, terrified glance, and then the patrol station behind them exploded. A deafening boom sent her sprawling forwards, her hands and chin scraping across the pavement. She felt a scorching heat of fire at her back and rolled onto her side with a groan. She looked over to Draco, who was struggling to his hands and knees. "Your people?" she gasped, lifting herself onto her elbow. He nodded and dipped his shoulder to reach into Hermione's drawstring pack. "Perhaps now's the time for my wand," she asked. "Nice try." Draco withdrew his hawthorn wand and slung the pack over his shoulder. He gained his feet, staggered over to her, and extended a hand to help her up. She took it, then yanked him down with a yell. "Bitch!" he screamed. It was barely audible over the hiss of the curse that had scissored the space he just vacated. He flinched as the patrol coast sign fell to the ground with a shatter of brittle plastic and a fizzle of electrical circuitry. "You're welcome," Hermione muttered, pulling him to his feet.
"Suppose we have our answer now, don't we?"
Amicus Carra's gravelly voice sent fear coursing through Hermione's body. He advanced slowly, twirling his wand between his fingers. His sister, Alecto, thin and sharp-shouldered, approached from their flank. "Man," Alecto agreed with an exaggerated eye roll. "Leave them alone for long enough, and even dogs start to look appealing. Did you enjoy a mudblood cunt, boy?" Amicus made a show of adjusting the front of his trousers.
"Maybe I'll take a turn myself."
"Alecto, no longer meeting your needs," Draco spat.
"What a shame."
Amicus roared in fury and whipped a spell at them. Alecto cast quietly, a well-aimed shiv, while her brother used a hammer. Draco deflected the first, but the second cut into his side. He staggered backwards. Hermione caught him by the arm. They traded a look. "On my signal," he said. "What?" He flung a pair of spells at the siblings, then pivoted. "Run!" She sprinted after him, past the patrol station, which plumed black smoke into the grey sky. Muggles had gathered around the burning structure, screaming and snapping photos with their mobiles as the wail of emergency sirens grew louder. Draco shoved through the crowd, steering them toward the neighborhood. Hermione flinched as a hex whistled past her head, striking a tree. Horror cut through her as the healthy brown trunk withered to black and its bright yellow leaves turned to ash, drifting with the wind. The Carras were not casting to capture. They were casting to kill. "The Firth!" Hermione shouted. "We need to get to the water!" Draco acknowledged her with a nod and shot another spell over his shoulder as they turned, sprinting farther into the residential area.
"If it's the city you're heading for, don't bother,"
Amicus shouted. Hermione shielded her face and head as a branch fell from an overhead tree, the impact missing her by less than a foot. "We killed those poofters," Alecto added with a cackle. "Right over for us." Rage burned in Hermione's chest, both at the slurs and at what the siblings might mean by them. She wanted a wand to turn and face them and make them pay. But Draco had kept her unarmed, and Amicus and Alecto hadn't walked half the length of Scotland over the past few days. The siblings were gaining ground. Fighting wasn't a viable option. Draco had realized it too. "Keep going!" He stopped for a second and took aim, and Hermione saw a car lift off its wheel and go flying. A shout, a crash, the screech of crumpled metal. Hermione shot out into the lead, and Draco followed, his cheeks spotted red from exertion. She turned north and saw the masts of sailboats in the harbour. If they could reach the water, they had a chance. She put on a pathetic burst of speed as Draco continued to whip careless spells over his shoulders, raking a path of destruction behind them. Alecto shrieked in pain. Something must have connected. That would create some space. Hopefully it was enough. Her feet pounded over the cracked, uneven pavement of the Queen's Ferry pier. "The bag!" she cried, turning to Draco as she reached the pier's end. "I need my cloak, now!" "Not a time," he added through heavy exhales. The carriers had reached the pier and stalked towards them, with teeth bared. like wolves that had cornered a pair of rabbits. "Draco!" Whether it was the use of his given name or the raw desperation in her voice, Hermione couldn't be sure. But she had caught his attention. He looked at her, performing a split-second assessment before tapping the bag with his wand. He tossed it to her, then flung a hex forward. The concrete at the carrow's feet exploded, sending the pair to their knees. Hermione yanked the bag apart, relieved to see the grey of his sealskin right on top. She withdrew it, closed the pack, and tossed it back to him. "We need to jump." "Are you mad?" "No!" But it was too late. A curse struck his chest, sending him spinning. His wand arced through the air, and she reached out a hand, slid into her palm as though it were meant for her. She cast on instinct. 2 flashes of green light, 2 thoughts as the bodies of Amicus and Alecto struck the concrete. Hermione's chest heaved. Then it was her stomach's turn. She doubled over and puked, retching through her desperate gasps for air. Noise pressed in around her. The Muggles' panicked voices, Draco's pained groans, and above it all, a roar, like wind howling through a mountain pass, cold, steady, and if she let it, shredding. But there wasn't time. If there were 2 Death Eaters, there would be more soon. They had to find somewhere safe. She hung the sealskin around her shoulders and knelt next to Draco. The wound on his side bled steadily, his breath short and shallow. He looked up at her, bleary-eyed. A strange, rueful smile preyed across his lips. "It was fun while it lasted," he rasped. Hermione almost laughed. The last few days hadn't been enjoyable in the least, but she understood his need for graveside humor. She had his wand. She had her bag. He was injured, maybe incapacitated, and if she left him, the Death Eaters would find him. Draco was as good as dead. She thought about it longer than she should have. Finally, she stowed his wand into her drawstring pack. "We need to get out of here," she said, helping him to his feet and leading him to the pier's edge. "I need you to carry both bags. Jump in after me and hold on tightly. Tap twice when you need to come up for air." Draco's eyes drooped, closed, his hand stained red where it pressed weakly against his side. He shook his head, confused. "What?" Hermione turned away from him and stared out at the water. Slipping into her sealskin was always easier than shedding it. She'd grown up with the affinity for the water, a yearning that only the ocean's infinite horizon could sate. She let herself feel it, let it consume her. Her sealskin wrapped around her, a poor, uncomfortable fit over her clothes. She felt bulky and clumsy, but it did not have to go far. An island sat just below the central tier of Forthbridge. Inchgarvey, fortified, unreachable, and, most importantly, uninhabited. She shuffled towards the pier's edge and looked up at Draco with wide eyes. If it had been any other circumstance, if she hadn't been travelling for 3 days, engaged in a firefight in Muggle Scotland, broken about 50 ministry laws, and killed 2 people, its expression of absolute shock would have made her laugh. Instead, she levered herself off the pier. The grey water was soft and welcoming around her. She felt a splash of Draco's entry and poked her head above the surface. She waited, bobbing easily as he looped his arm around her neck. Hermione gave him a second to catch his breath. Then she dove. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.